When you've been shot at with real bullets, it's sometimes hard to take the usual setbacks of daily life that seriously.
Even if you don't immediately recognise the name of this week's guest, you are almost certainly familiar with his work. Bill Broyles wrote the screenplays for Apollo 13, Castaway, Jarhead, Planet of the Apes and Flags of Our Fathers, among others. And Broyles' writing for the screen has been informed at least in part by an eventful personal life. As a young man, he was a US Marine Corps platoon commander in Vietnam, an experience he recalls in the Apple TV Plus series Vietnam, the War That Changed America. And he was subsequently a journalist, launching Texas Monthly and editing Newsweek before heading to Hollywood. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I spoke to Bill Broyles for the big interview. William Broyles, welcome to the big interview.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here.
Well, it's good to have you back on. We did talk to you a few weeks back about your participation in Apple's new series about Vietnam, the war that changed America. And I do want to come to your experiences there later in the show because they've obviously been very important. But I want to start with a line that appears in one of the films you wrote that will be familiar to our listeners, and this is the line that failure is not an option, spoken by Ed Harris's flight director Eugene Kranz in Apollo 13. Was that one you wrote? Did you contribute that line to the screenplay?
Oh, actually, that's an interesting story. We were talking to Jerry Bostic, who was one of the flight controllers in Mission Control. I remember sitting down with him at this crawfish place in this little funky Cajun restaurant near NASA, and I said, well, Jerry, there you were. You had the spaceship. They were 200,000 miles from home. There was no way to get them back. No human beings in the history of mankind have ever been so lost and so alone and so desperate. What were you thinking? He said, well, we just thought failure wasn't an option. And I said, could you repeat that, please? I wish I could take credit for making it up, but I had the good sense to write it down when it was told to me. And it seemed like it just completely summed up the spirit of those mission controllers at the time. And if I might, Andrew, can I just carry that story one step farther?
Sure.
Because it connects to this, and we can come back to Vietnam more clearly. But at about that same time they were trying to do that, I was on a mountaintop in Vietnam. And I was thinking basically my life, my career, everything was over. I was going to die in this muddy place with all these really cool 19-year-old teenagers and never be heard from again. And we saw this streak of light go across the sky. And I remembered it, and Jeff Hires did too. And years later, I think he'd already gone. I thought, oh my God, that was Apollo 13. And so it's interesting to think that even as we were in big picture, even as we were mired in this incredible quagmire in a war we had lost with no way out, feeling America was come to its first defeat at the time down in Houston and out in space, Americans were facing and we say it in the film, is this going to be NASA's darkest hour? And Ed Harris says, with respect, this is going to be our finest hour. Mm. So there were these things where this dark failure in Vietnam was happening simultaneously with this incredible rescue of people from 200,000 miles away, using all the best of what, our culture can do, even as I was mired in kind of the worst consequences of the mistakes we had made. And I often think of the contrast of those two moments, both personally, which is in my own personal dark hour, something was laid, and the seed was laid for something which was my very first film. But also in terms of America and American culture as a whole, the darkness and the light were existing simultaneously. The very nightmare of what we had created was going on with all the death and destruction and suffering, and this kind of hope for mankind's future was being carried out in NASA and outer space at the very same moment. And often people don't put those two together, but they were very much together for me personally, but I think also thematically in the history of that time.
Well, the reason I bring up that line, and I don't know if you know this, you may be pleased to know that you can get that line imprinted on coffee mugs at the Smithsonian Museum on the Mall in Washington, and I know that because I have one I bought there. But the reason I bring up that line, failure is not an option, is that it strikes me And I think it strikes you because a lot of your own commentary on your work has reflected quite a lot on the value of failure or the threat of failure or the prospect of failure. I mean, have you sort of got to the point of thinking that's the only way we ever learn? We need to go out there and screw things up.
Yeah, well, I don't know if we need to, but it seems like we often do. And whether we need to or not, few of us welcome failure, right? But I think it's everything in my life that's been good has grown out of some kind of failure. I was going off to graduate school and law school or whatever, and I got drafted and ended up in Vietnam, and that felt like a failure, but it turned out to be a really important part of my life. I mean, I went up in the ladder of success in journalism to become editor-in-chief of Newsweek, and I was terrible at it. It was the worst job I ever did. I mean, I was not cut out to run a huge institution. I was more cut out to run, smaller guerrilla operations, creative efforts, and I failed spectacularly. But that led me to go out to LA and try to, as a homeless Vietnam vet with no employment, and try to do something with film. And I ended up doing a TV series, China Beach, which was about Vietnam. And so I came to be more suspicious of success. When I got to the point where I was doing things really well and people thought I was great and I was success and status, that, well, what am I learning here? And am I just coasting or am I putting myself in a box? And I think there's something, I mean, the Buddhists call it beginner's mind. When you fail, you have to start again. And there's something that makes your life fresh and intense and awake when you're having to start over. I've just had a series of careers. I mean, I've never planned to do any of these things. I never planned to go into journalism. That happened. I never planned to go to Vietnam. I never planned to go out and do film. And one thing just led to another. And that's true, that failure is really, we should embrace it.
But to take that thought back to Vietnam, as I understand it, you were drafted, but you didn't have to go, did you? You could have avoided it if you'd felt like it, but you decided to go.
Well, yeah, it was one of those moral issues where I'd been demonstrating against the war and I was against the war, but at the same time, I tell this story in the documentary. That I watched the Tet Offensive, and there was this young Marine under fire, and they interviewed him with bullets all around. What's going on? I don't know. I just want to get home and go back to school. I grew up in a refinery town, a working class refinery town in Texas, and that kid was just like all the kids I went to high school with. And I knew that if I avoided the draft, someone else from my town would have to go in my place. And there was this sense of, I was in Oxford having high tea and this privileged life, and people I knew from high school were dying in Vietnam. And I thought, I'm not going to do that. And when I went to my draft physical in Newark, New Jersey in 1968, I mean, there were only like 4 white guys in the whole group, and 3 of them had all these medical records, and they were gone in like 15 minutes. It was a time where the draft was picking up the people, the outsiders, the expendables, the dropouts, and all the people of privilege like me were able to avoid it. And so it was I call it a war for us fought by them, and the guys that I served with in my platoon, they were just a list of I had like probably 10 high school graduates or 15 out of 50 guys. But they were actually, I learned more from them than I learned at Oxford. They were incredible human beings, and I would serve with them again in a heartbeat, and if I had to go to war again, which hopefully I don't think they would want me at 80. But yeah, it's really an interesting thing. I mean, it's Andrew, you're onto something.
But when you think back about the Vietnam experience within the framework of the life you've lived since, do you think going through that, surviving that, did give you a kind of fearlessness? You just come back from that thinking, well, if that doesn't put a scratch on me, then what's going to?
Yeah, I was lucky, and a lot of people had a much worse war than I did. But often what we said is that when we were doing things, in Vietnam, like when we did that mission, we said, well, what are they going to do to us? Cut off our hair and send us to Vietnam? And we were already there. But, when you've been shot at with real bullets, it's sometimes hard to take the usual setbacks of daily life that seriously. When you've been blessed to survive, without any physical injury and come home in one piece and been able to get on with my life as I did, I feel blessed and lucky and humble. But it's also, there's a sense of perspective about things that seem so important in the ladder of success or our workplace or our personal lives, that being in war, it does, it haunts you. It's like, it's not like, I can't look at it as just like I advise people to go off to war because it'll make their lives better, because it often in many ways, creates challenges and makes it worse. But there's a pride also in having been willing to give yourself for a group of other people, which I learned with these men. One of the things they taught me was that they would have died for each other. They would have done it. They would have died. I would have died for them. They would have died for me. I mean, except maybe for my kids, you don't get that in daily life. And you don't get that sense of, when you wake up every morning, what you do matters and it counts, and people are depending on you. Their lives are depending on you, and you've got to do your job. And that's what we did every day. It's hard to go back into real life where it's just all the material things, and you're out for your individual success and happiness, and you have to lose a sense of community, really. And all in all, I think that experience is a positive one. Actually being involved in this series and having it all come back and talking about it has brought up some things, and be back in touch with some people in my platoon and listening to all the people. And there's a lot of pain in this series. And it's not like the war was 50 years ago. If you see it, so many of the people in it, it's alive right now, and it's in their lives. And some of them still have pain and trauma and moral injuries, if they don't have physical injuries that they're still struggling with. And I am too. I wouldn't wish war on anyone, but since I did do it, I've tried to make it a positive thing in my life. In many ways, it has been. You learn a lot in the Marine Corps about what including just when you think you can't take another step, you actually can. That's one of the main things. And then also that you need to stand up and be there for the people around you.
I mean, you've written a lot about that experience in non-fiction terms. You wrote a book, Brothers in Arms, I think, in about the mid-1980s, about going back to Vietnam and meeting some of the people that you'd fought a war against. But as you mentioned earlier, your first major venture into screenwriting was China Beach, set in Vietnam. Did you get to a place of thinking it was easier, I guess, to explain to people what war and conflict is like through the media of fiction than trying to explain it in non-fiction? Because it is, and I have myself reported from a few rickety destinations at various points, it is quite a hard thing to describe to people, I find.
You're right. And if you've been there, it's just, it's like trying to, in a minor key, it's like trying to do the Holocaust. It's an extreme of human experience. I'm not comparing, certainly not my experience, but it's beyond the range of normal human experience. It just is. It's hard to convey. I mean, China Beach, I went into the hospital to see someone in my platoon, and I walked in and I'd seen people injured and things, but the hospital was like the size of the Raiders of the Lost Ark warehouse, and at the end, and it was full of just wounded, maimed, dismembered teenagers, burned as far as you could see. And I just looked at it and I fainted. Boom. Fell on the floor, broke my nose. And that was my war injury, my heroic injury. And a nurse helped me come to, and I looked at her and I just couldn't. To this day, I still don't know how she did that every day. And that stayed with me. And that was the inspiration for China Beach. I thought, if we could look at the war through the lens of women who were there to serve and help, that would be a fresh way to see it.
Because have you been...
I love working on that show.
Have you been frustrated, though, as... I'm interested in this from you, from somebody who has written screenplays for films about war and also served in one. Do you often see yourself, or have you seen many other representations on screen of war that have made you think, actually, that's what it's like, that's pretty much spot on, that's, congruent with my own recollections?
They're pieces of film that just ring incredibly true to me. There's a scene in Platoon where Charlie Sheen is waiting in ambush, and he's hallucinating, and suddenly a Viet Cong just appears out of nothing, like materializes. That's pretty amazing. And There's some scenes with you have synesthesia, which is kind of what you get in acid trips or something, where sounds become colors and colors become sounds. Like, when you first, sometimes you get bullets incoming and you don't hear them, but you just see twigs and pieces of mud, and there have been some films that have captured some of that. And I think fictional things is the only way to do it, because you can't create it in documentaries, although this one has such an immersive quality to it because they found the actual footage.
Mm.
And so much of that footage that is shot is on patrol. The camera is just looking forward as you're going down the paths, and you hear the creaking of the packs and the twigs, and it's pretty darn good for just those moments. But to capture the whole experience, and like Louis Armstrong said about jazz, if you don't know what it is, I can't tell you.
But when you were writing screenplays for films such as, for example, Jarhead, Flags of Our Fathers, did you have a sense of mission, thinking there are things about that experience I would like to express in this film that I haven't seen expressed elsewhere? There are things that people aren't getting right because they haven't seen it up close.
Yeah, there are a few scenes in Jarhead that I really had some fun with. And fun, I use that word fun advisedly because, it's not, there's nothing about word particularly fun, although you have a lot of humorous moments, just the parade coming home and just the waiting and the anticipation and the tension and some of the humor and the spookiness and the Jamie Foxx character, just one of those lifers who really loves his job.
Mm.
He's found their place in life and is good at it, and taking care of him.
There's that great scene when they're watching the oil wells burn, and he just says,
Yes.
Where else would you get to see something like this?
Yeah, I know. And that's part of it. There is a sense of seeing, like, I once described it as like lifting up the corner of the universe and seeing what's underneath, and some of those things you wish you hadn't seen, but it expands the spectrum of human experience on both sides, on the dark side and on the light side. That war expands your experience into darkness is well known, but the other side, that you do see some of the most beautiful aspects of what we as humans have to give and can express, that's not so often talked about. And I don't mean like heroism and falling on a grenade all for your buddies, but that's symbolic in a way. But it's like my radio man, Jeff Hires, just said that when we had that reunion, I was just talking to him, and we hadn't seen each other for, 40 years or 30, 40 years. And we just couldn't talk, and we're just holding on to each other. He said that's being with each other, you just releases things or touches things, or lets your body release things that you kept hidden and buried from everybody else. And those can be dark things, but those can be some positive things. I'm a big fan of Viktor Frankl, who was in 4 concentration camps, including Auschwitz. And he says that part of our search for meaning is to find ways to overcome darkness. Mm-hmm. And if we can, and a couple of people, and like Joan Fury, the nurse in this same episode as me, said that in spite of all that she went through and all the horror that she saw and how it transformed her into an anti-war activist, that Vietnam made her a better person, a stronger person.
Earlier in this conversation, describing, I think, yourself as a young Marine Corps lieutenant in Vietnam, you used the phrase lost, alone and desperate, which, of course, could have been the slogan on the posters for what may be your best-known film, which is Castaway, which I guess is, like a lot of your other work, is all about survival and about trying to overcome things as well. But with that one, I guess, because you didn't have the experience yourself of having been stranded on a desert island, you decided you would go and do that, though. You actually went and marooned yourself for 10 days or so somewhere off Mexico, as I understand it. Why was that important to you? Was that just the sort of the gonzo journalist, I guess, who'd founded Texas Monthly coming out? I must do this in order to write about it.
Well, partly because I'd written a draft of the screenplay based on like reading accounts of people and other movies, and it just sucked. Honestly, it was no good. It had no authenticity, and it was just I said I don't want to see this movie, or I've already seen this movie. So I just thought it was like writing about Vietnam, or like you say, writing about war is hard if you haven't been there. I mean, Stephen Crane in Red Badge of Courage did it, but it's hard if it's hard. And so I just went down and spent 10 days on the Sea of Cortez, and everything you see in Castaway, trying to open a coconut and trying to spear fish and eating raw fish and trying to make fire. I did all that. And it's really like I wouldn't have known how much you needed shelter, and I wouldn't have known how hard it was to find water, and I wouldn't have known how beautiful it would taste to finally cook the raw stingray that I've been eating raw for a week. And and the Mormon hippies who took me there were like 3 sand dunes away, and I couldn't make fire. That was the problem. It was everything you see in the film. The Boy Scout stuff that doesn't work. And the wind changed, and they were cooking bacon, and so the smell of cooking bacon and the sound of the Grateful Dead kind of wafted over me in my lonely little palm frond sand shelter with raw stingray. And I just said, I give up, guys. I can't make fire. Can you show me how? So they showed me how, and I went back and I made the fire. And I felt like, okay, I've got the movie. But then I stayed a few nights and I got really lonely, and I thought, wow, this is something. And then I went down to the beach and there was a volleyball I had washed up, and I started talking to it. And as I was leaving, I was left the volleyball. I stopped and I said, wait a minute, idiot. That's the movie. The movie's the volleyball.
This is the thing I wanted to ask, because I know, and this is, I think, something all journalists, all reporters do when they are in the field of any sort. You're always looking for that quote, that incident, that moment that just makes you think, yes, there it is. There's my story. Was that how you felt upon encountering the volleyball?
I wish I could say I saw it right away, but I didn't. I thought, oh my God, it's not just about physical survival. It's about how we're not meant to be alone. That we are social creatures, that the I is less important than the we. And if we need to connect to be human, and if we can't, don't have anyone else human to connect to, well, we make a volleyball and we make a human substitute. And honestly, that his love for that volleyball, I think, and when he loses Wilson, it's tough when he loses his fiance again at the end, but when he loses Wilson, I watch the movie, I cry every time. I gotta say, I'm such a sucker.
But I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was wondering about the experience of watching your words on big screens read by famous actors. And you have been very fortunate, and you've got to see your words delivered by some extremely good actors. But nevertheless, even if it is Tom Hanks, or as we mentioned before, Ed Harris, is it hard letting go of a script? Are you always just perfectly happy to watch it? Is no part of you sitting there thinking, oh no, not like that?
Well, I have to confess that I have written films that I've wanted to put a paper bag over my head when they come out, because they have. But others are, been far better than I imagined. But I want to make a point, though. It's interesting. It's not just my words that they say, it means a lot. But like in Castaway, everything Tom Hanks does silently, is scripted, and the idea is to try to do the physical actions that a good actor can do, and then express his internal feelings, not with words, because movies that comes from moving pictures, and the origin of that whole medium is silent movies, is film, is visuals. And it was Bob and Tom and I, we wanted to make a silent movie and see if we could, somehow con DreamWorks and Fox into giving us $100 million to do that. And it was to return to the roots of filmmaking and try to and it worked with the story, obviously, because there's nobody there but him. But I did have, in the course of the script, I would have him voice a few things. And then as we kept going, I'd keep Xing them out. And the studios, they wanted voiceover. They wanted the big score to help the audience. They wanted to cut back to Helen Hunt at home. And I just said, no. You have to be completely immersed in the silence and hear only what he hears. Having him act out the story that I wrote without dialogue is probably something I'm more proud of than any dialogue I've ever written.
Well, on that somewhat elegiac note, we are unfortunately running to the end of our time. I feel like I'd be happy to do an episode of this every week. But just finally, what are you actually working on now?
I'm probably going to write something about Vietnam, because it's brought up all this stuff. And talking to you and, bringing this out and connect it to my film. And I've been writing about it for years and decades, but this experience of not just being in the documentary and or reuniting, but talking to someone like you and having seen what it brings up has resonated with me, and I've been going through a lot of. It's been disturbing, inspiring, challenging, and so I'm thinking of working on that. I would love to figure a way, to see what happened to Chuck after Castaway. I hadn't thought about that for 25 years, but now as I'm in this point in my life and Chuck is there, I'm really curious as to what he did. And so I don't know if that's any chance of that getting done, but that would be something I'd be interested in. But and what else? I've been doing a lot of psychedelic and spiritual exploration as I get older, and some of the Vietnam things have come up in that. I'm probably going to write. I'm really interested in writing about that. I think that's a frontier of human experience that's similar to space or war or any other sort of extreme things, but it's the interior journey. So that's something that's on my mind. And that's probably more than I could handle. So I'll just stop there.
Bill Broyles, thank you very much for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Big Interview. It was produced by Gunnar Grunlid and edited by Jack Dewars. From me, Andrew Mueller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.